welcome to Edison Open House Global Healthcare 2021. In this session, we're focusing on the work of InMed Pharma, a Canadian company specializing in rare cannabinoids, that's substances derived from cannabis, to treat rare disease. With me is their CEO, Eric Adams. Eric, welcome from Vancouver.
Thank you, Vivienne. It's nice to be with you here today.
So people are very familiar with CBD and THC, and in fact, you can hardly get away from them. They're in cookies, they're in all sorts of things. But what you're looking at is the potentially much greater therapeutic effect of the rarer compounds. So can you tell me a bit more about these rarer compounds?
Sure, glad to. So InMed is a pharmaceutical company, and we're specializing in developing this class of compounds called cannabinoids. This group of compounds comes from the cannabis plant, and that's where they get their names. Most people are familiar with what we call the major cannabinoids, which are THC and CBD. Now, these are each individual compounds, of which there's over 100 in the cannabis plant. These are very well studied and recognized because they are in very high abundance in the plant. They're very easy to extract from the plant. And people have been researching their benefits for over 30 years now. So if you try to do a search on publications on these two, you'll get thousands and tens of thousands of publications. So they're very widely understood and known. There's these other 100 cannabinoids, though, which are referred to as rare cannabinoids, that we're interested in. Now, they're called rare because they exist in very low quantities in the plant. They're very hard to extract from the plant. They're very expensive to extract from the plant. So these things can cost tens of thousands of dollars per gram in order to isolate them and then study them individually. But these are the class where we think there's a lot of potential. Now, I don't believe all 100 are going to have important therapeutic benefits in humans, but I bet you there's a dozen or so that are going to have meaningful benefit in diseases with high unmet medical needs. And that's really where InMed comes in. We're looking at specific individual rare cannabinoids, and we're developing those as pharmaceutical-based products to treat a number of different diseases.
So how do you match the rare cannabinoid that you found with the disease? I mean, what makes the match between the two?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So each of these cannabinoids tend to have individual physiological or chemical characteristics that make them unique from all the others. Now, a lot of them will behave similarly in certain circumstances, but individually they may act differently in other instances. And that's really what we're looking at. This group of compounds interacts with the human body through a number of different specific receptors. There's the endocannabinoid system, which most people are familiar with. This helps regulate a number of things like mood, like appetite, pain, stress, things like that. But there's a number of other receptors that aren't related specifically to these compounds where cannabinoids will have an effect. And it's really those other areas that we're particularly interested in. And what we find is that as we start to look at different diseases and the receptors and the tissues that are involved, you can identify an individual cannabinoid that is going to have a meaningful therapeutic benefit in treating disease. And that's really what we do. So we look across specific diseases. We understand certain things about these cannabinoids and how they might react. And then what we want to do is find the best ones that are going to lead to a very meaningful benefit in different patient types.
And presumably with these rare cannabinoids, where you've got these, the receptors only in a few, relatively few places, that means that you won't get the off-target effects that the major cannabinoids get, because you've got cannabinoid receptors, throughout the body, haven't you, particularly in the brain?
Yeah, that's correct. So I think as a class of compounds, you're going to see many of them interact with the endocannabinoid system, and that's throughout the body. The human body makes two of its own special cannabinoids that are responsible for interacting with these receptors. But as I said, there's a number of other receptors, and understanding the affinity of one cannabinoid over the other for this specific receptor site is really what leads to, kind of the scientific innovation that we're doing at InMed.
Tell me the story of epidermolysis bullosa, or EB, which is a terrible skin disease, and how you came to be involved with that.
Sure. Well, EB is a group of genetic disorders that affect the integrity of the skin. These disorders can take place at the different layers of skin. It can happen at the outermost layer of skin, which is the epidermis, and then below that you have the dermis, and then the dermis has a number of different layers in it as well. So there's hundreds of different mutations that may affect the skin and fall under this umbrella of epidermolysis bullosa. Now, in total, it's a very rare condition. It's often referred to as the worst disease you've never heard of. And what happens is these genetic mutations affect the ability of the skin to maintain its integrity. So if the malformation takes place at the epidermis and the dermis, then you can have the skin easily tear or blister and separate from each other. The deeper that you go, the more severe the disease is, because you can imagine as you get down to the lower levels of the skin, if that's where the problem is and you have a wound there, it's a very deep wound. So this condition is genetic. People are born with it. The more severe forms, unfortunately, people tend not to live into their teenage years because they're constantly covered with wounds that are open to infection, and they typically succumb to infection. There's currently no approved treatments for this. There are a number of gene therapies that are looking to, completely resolve the disease. Very expensive treatment, and they're looking specifically at the more severe forms of it for those treatments. There are a number of gels that are under development for a number of different things, including wound healing. So that's where we come in, as we identified the fact that cannabinoids interact with the human body to up and down regulate a protein called keratins, and there's about 25, 26 different keratins in the human body. And depending on which specific cannabinoid you use, you can turn up the production of keratins, or you could turn down the production of keratins. What's interesting about CBN, or cannabinol, which is the rare cannabinoid we've chosen for this indication, is that it may be able to increase the production of one type of keratin that can lead to a strengthening of the bond between these two layers of skin where the genetic defect may be taking place. So longer term, we're looking at not only the relief of symptoms, because in addition to increasing the keratin production, we also know that cannabinol, or CBN, can address things like wounds, inflammation, pain, possibly some other things involved in EB. So we're developing the skin cream to be used on a daily basis to treat not only the symptoms, but also potentially see some degree of disease modification by increasing keratin production, and by thereby increasing the integrity of the skin over time.
Yeah, keratin is the protein that we normally associate with our nails and with our hair, that kind of thing. And you recently announced, I think, some data for this program. Tell me a bit more about that.
Sure. Well, as with any pharmaceutical compound, you have to do an extensive series of testing before it can be approved for use. That starts with kind of the preclinical testing, understanding the characteristics of the compound. It involves a lot of toxicology studies and pharmacology studies, and understand exactly how that compound interacts in the human body and how safe it is. And recently, we conducted 2 phase 1, what's called phase 1 clinical trials. These trials are designed to test the safety of the active ingredient, which is the cannabinol, on human skin. Now, we didn't want to go straight into EB patients to test this because they're already suffering from a lot of things, and you don't want to put an experimental treatment on them to see whether it hurts them or not. First thing you want to do is start with normal skin. So we had 2 different cohorts of healthy volunteers. The first group received a very wide area of their back, about 5% of their body surface area was covered with our cream. And then we looked to see, are there any adverse events? Is there any untoward swelling or redness or pain or itch or these kinds of things. And essentially, there was no difference between the cream by itself and the cream that contains the CBN. So that was good. It was very positive news. We then moved on to a smaller group of patients. Again, they're healthy volunteers, but we made little bitty blister wounds on their skin. We used a suction device that basically pulled the outer layer, the epidermis, away from the dermis, and it formed a blister. And what we then did is we cut off the top of the blister, just kind of the blister that you would have on your hands from playing tennis. We cut off the blister, exposing the dermis underneath. And then we treated that area. And what we wanted to do is, again, look at just the safety parameters. Is it painful? Does it cause any swelling or itching or what have you? But also importantly, we also checked to make sure that it wasn't slowing down the actual wound healing, the normal progression of wound healing. Because we know CBN is an anti-inflammatory agent, it can stop inflammation. Well, when you have a wound, you actually want inflammation early on. You want the body to recruit all of the elements it needs to start healing that wound. Excuse me. So we had to test to make sure we weren't slowing that aspect down. And comparing the treated areas to the untreated areas, we saw that there was no negative impact on wound healing, which is a big first step. The type of inflammation we think CBN will be useful for is the chronic inflammation, and it actually has a different set of mechanisms from what an early wound would look like. So again, it was a study to look at the safety aspects of it. The data was very positive, and now we're positioned to move into clinical trials in EB patients themselves. Currently, we are ramping up towards that, and it looks like we'll be in a position in the second half of the year to start enrolling patients in that very interesting clinical trial.
And have you had any issues? I don't know what the state of COVID is in Canada, but have you had any issues in terms of recruitment to trials because of COVID?
We've been very fortunate that it was only a limited impact. So the first 2 human studies took place in the Netherlands, and there were some travel restrictions towards the end of the study. And we were not, significantly negatively impacted by COVID. That's certainly something that we have to keep in mind now as we look towards enrolling patients in the next trial. That will take place in the second half of the year, and we'll just have to carefully monitor what the status is.
It's a fascinating area, and I want to move us now to the other indication, which is as far away as possible from EB. It's the eye disease, glaucoma. And it goes back to, I guess, to my initial question about, why do you choose these particular diseases to benefit from cannabinoids, or these rare cannabinoids? So tell me a bit about your glaucoma program.
Sure, that's a very interesting observation. So a lot of times medical research is based on anecdotal evidence. So, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that people who smoke marijuana can use that to treat their glaucoma and the pain that they feel and seek some kind of relief. So we want to understand, well, is that a real effect, and what causes that effect? So we started to, again, test a wide number of cannabinoids against different models of glaucoma to see if there was a preferential cannabinoid that would be used in ocular disease. What we found is that, again, cannabinol in this instance, CBN, rose above all the other cannabinoids in one important aspect, and that is neuroprotection. So to tell a little bit about what glaucoma is, if you have your eyeball, and let's say this is the optic nerve at the back of it, fluid builds up in the front of the eye, and that pushes pressure all the way through the eye onto the back. And in the back is where all these nerve cells are that are responsible for vision. So you want to do 2 things. First of all, you want to reduce the fluid. And what we've learned is that most cannabinoids can do that. They can relax the drainage network here and facilitate the fluid going away. But what was interesting about CBN is that it actually goes to the back of the eye to where these neurons are, and it proactively protects them from damage. Now, other cannabinoids had a slight effect in this regard, but CBN had a very strong effect in this regard. So that's really where we patented our know-how and what we found out about this disease. So glaucoma is the first ocular indication that we're pursuing for those reasons. It has this dual effect. But you could start to think that, well, if we're protecting the neurons from dying, that's important in a number of eye diseases. Anything where the progression of the disease leads to blindness, there's some kind of neural death going on there. So, down the road, we may be able to look at CBN, or the compound internally named INM088. We can look at that program in a number of different ocular diseases in order to prevent neural death, or to provide this level of neuroprotection.
Now, there's quite a lot of products available or in being considered for the treatment of glaucoma. What do you think will distinguish your product in that busy market?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of the products that are out there now focus on just the drainage of the fluid at the front of the eye. And if you take off the pressure, then you're relieving the pressure on the back of the eye. So indirectly, they're having a neuroprotective effect. So you can envision that the patients are going to maintain their vision longer. But it's this dual effect of CBN where it's not only draining the fluid, but it is proactively having an interaction with those neurons that is prolonging their survival. And that's the effect that we think is going to be very important.
And what are the next steps to getting it to market?
Well, we recently in-licensed the delivery technology. So we have the drug. We now have to get it to the site where we need it. We in-licensed the delivery technology called MyDrops from a company called ICRO. And that took place in November. And we've already done extensive testing with this. We now have to tweak the formulation a little bit to optimize it. And then we'll be able to go in and complete the toxicology aspect of drug development. And that is to understand, what doses are safe and how those match up with doses that we think will be efficacious. This will lead to us entering human clinical trials sometime in probably the first half of 2022.
And what's your partnership strategy here? Is this something that you want to produce yourself, or are you going to do licensing, or how are you going to do this?
Yeah, well, we have three assets that are core to the company right now. We have the INM 755 in EB, that's the skin cream. We have INM 088, which is the eye drop for glaucoma. And we have our manufacturing technology, which we haven't talked about, but we needed to come up with a way to enable the manufacturing of these rare cannabinoids because they're so expensive to extract from the plant. Each of those have moved very nicely this last year, and I think each of them are at a point where they could be monetized. So what does that look like? We can license, we can do partnerships, we can do collaborative work arrangements, but we're at a point where I think external parties are now interested in what we're doing, certainly demonstrating that we can move a product through initial early clinical trials is something that people are interested in. So we're in a position now where we can talk with external parties, identify what their interests are, particularly in different fields of drug development, and start to build partnerships around them. So at the end of the day, I don't know that we would be in a position to build a kind of commercial infrastructure to launch a glaucoma product. You would have to have a massive set of, the sales force would have to be big and on a global scale. I don't think we're going to get there in the next several years, but there are a lot of people who are interested in building either a new presence in the field of eye disease, or they currently have one and they need more products to fill their pipeline. So I think we're well positioned to have a very busy year in business development.
So what should investors look out for over the next 6 to 12 months?
That's a good question. So we had a great year last year, having completed the 2 phase 1 clinical trials, having in-licensed the delivery technology in ocular disease, made some good strides forward with our manufacturing technology, and we were listed on the NASDAQ in November. So I think we have a really strong foundation. Now it's just a matter of executing on our game plan. So we're preparing now for the regulatory filings that are necessary to launch the EB trial. We are completing formulation development and moving into toxicology, which is a really important step for the ocular program. And we have a number of milestones that we project hitting in our manufacturing technology called Integrison, where we are putting together kind of the manufacturing end-to-end under pharmaceutical GMP standards, which is really big. And we continue to look at additional cannabinoids and other disease areas where we think these rare cannabinoids can have an important impact in treating the disease.
And what about your cash runway?
Yeah, so we completed an IPO financing in November that netted the company about 6.8 million US. We haven't released our financials yet for the end of 2020, but we're in a position now where we have anywhere from 12 to 18 months cash runway, depending on how aggressively we spend it, of course. So, that combined with the opportunity to do some business development deals, I think we're well positioned to be able to execute on all of our programs.
Now, this area is one where there's a great deal of hype, and the internet is full of cannabinoid stories, which are certainly a great deal of them not true. How do you deal with that kind of noise in the system with regards to cannabinoids, and persuade investors that you're, I won't say legitimate, but you know what I mean. That you're the real pharma deal, rather than this kind of noise that's going on, off scene and on the internet.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. Certainly, I think if anyone wants to understand what CBD does or does not do, they need to look at GW Pharma and look at the use and instructions for Epidiolex, because they did extensive research looking at what that compound can do and actually what it does not do in the human body. So if you want to cut through all of the fog, that's the best way to do it. If you want to learn about CBN, go to our website, take a look. Don't believe the hype. There's a lot of people trying to position this as a drug for all kinds of weird things. And we've seen no evidence of most of the things that are being said on the internet. It's not data-based. It's just people trying to come up with a new over-the-counter something or another. And you shouldn't pay attention to that. But if you really want to understand what these compounds can or cannot do, find a company that specializes in it, read what they're doing and what their data says, and that's the best way to go.
That's really helpful. Now, 2020 has been a difficult year for everyone, personally, nationally, globally. But how are you and InMed Pharma seeing 2021 as it comes up?
Well, we're very excited about it. I think from a corporate standpoint, we had a very low impact, negative impact on us from a COVID perspective. We were a little bit ahead of the curve. We shut down the offices in early February of last year. It helps to have a PhD virologist on your staff who, understands the warning signs, and so we implemented a pandemic preparedness plan very early on. From a work standpoint, we've hardly skipped a beat. We've been able to do that remotely very well. As I mentioned, in our EV trials, we were only minorly impacted by the shutdowns. We're really excited that now with the vaccines out there, slowly societies can start to return to normal. It would be great to get back to the office and see all of my colleagues on a daily basis for sure. But in the meantime, we're going to weather the storm like everyone else. We're going to continue to do our best to, isolate and wear our masks if we are out in public. And when the time comes, get our vaccines and start getting things back to normal.
Eric Adams, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much.